Welcome to another Drawing in the Dark. My name is Levi Smith. I draw and tattoo for a living. And today, we're going to draw V for Vendetta. I always start by blocking out a few shapes for the figure, starting with the torso and keeping my line work very light, especially when using a ballpoint pen. And as usual, as I draw this, I'm using some reference of V from a variety of sources online. And I want to fill the page, so I keep that in mind for my composition, and I want to know what the figure is doing in the scene. I imagine that V is monologuing his latest victim here. My materials aren't too fancy, ballpoint pen and an Illo sketchbook, but any paper will do. The figure and character aren't too complex here, so what I'll be focusing on is contrast after I get all of the elements blocked out here. These left hands, I don't know why, but I seem to struggle with them, at least in the drawing videos. A quick layout here for the face, building it up in the Rodgon method with a kind of ski mask. I'll work out how the hat fits, keeping in mind that it fits around his head, not on it. And a few quick lines for his hair. His cape drapes across his shoulders, but without an obvious brooch or clip. I stretch the cape to his elbows before extending it to the floor. A few indications here for leg volume. And I'll work in this belt along with the edge line for his glove and center line in the tunic before blocking out the bottom part of said tunic. And I at least get one hand doing something interesting. This right hand comes together nicely along with the knife. Even though his costume is simple in relative terms to most comic book creators, it is very specific in its detail, so I do stay mindful of that with his belt, knives, and the cut of his tunic. His head looks a bit oversized to me, but considering the mask and the wide-brimmed hat, it seemed unavoidable. Working up his face, I follow the simplified Loomis method called the Rodgon method, and it's really nice how well it works here. The construction lines I use land exactly where the key features fall in the V mask, and I'm able to work out the whole mask without any trouble. I'll save the final shading of the mask for the very end though. Once I have all the elements worked out with a soft line, I'll go back through the figure and refine it a bit, reinforcing the lines I want to keep with a slightly darker line. Still not going to the full darkness of the pen, which I will build up to gradually. I'm using a new camera for this one. I got a basic 4K camera from Amazon and put it on a desk arm. So far it's working out okay, though I still need to do some fine tuning with the focal length and general lighting of the area that I'm recording, but it's an upgrade, even if a small one. I've also hunted down some fresh music for background noise, and I figured some Beethoven is a good fit for a V drawing. And already we get into some light shading. Really, this piece is like 5-6 shading. With these early passes on the shading, I'm just looking to block out some of the areas to establish some basic contrast. I'll be shading nearly every aspect of this drawing, and don't want to get ahead of myself. If I shade an area at this point that I realize should be lighter, it's not a problem yet. And while I don't have to worry very much about the interior detail in the elements of the figure, that does mean that my contour details have to be stronger. So I'll spend a bit more time reinforcing those as I go. The point here is to be thinking ahead towards where the piece will end up and build towards that, versus just randomly making marks at a whim, as that would likely lead me to drawing in areas that will be heavily shaded, or working up areas too much, or generalizing areas that should be more specific. You'll also notice I block out some areas like in the cape that I know will be some of the darkest areas. This helps me visualize some of the shaded areas before I get into shading them. For example, V isn't a heavily muscled character, and his costume is designed to disappear into itself. So adding a lot of muscle detail or wrinkles in his arms and torso would actually detract from the desired effect and wouldn't be in line with the established character design. And yet, while that is also true for his legs, I do suggest that he has strong legs with the contour lines. And as I shade in the inner cape and legs areas, even though I focus on what will be the darkest areas, I still shade them in lightly as I want to be aware of my light-dark relationships and build them up as deliberately as possible. With the dynamics of this piece relying as heavily on the contrast of light and dark as it does, I don't want to generalize any of these elements, even a detail as subtle as his bangs under the hat. I'll also use the shading as a textural element, such as his hair. Though as I build up the cross-hatching in areas, I'll use it in many areas to suggest a matte texture to his costume overall. Once I have all of my guiding structure laid down for an element, I'll go into the heavier shading as I do with the hat. A particularly important factor to keep in mind when using ink heavily, whether it's a ballpoint pen, inking pens, brush, nib, or whatever, is to work in a pattern that allows your hand to move away from the fresh work, but not into any other fresh work. That usually means starting in one of the top corners and working your way down and away from that corner. Which corner you start in will depend on if you're right or left-handed. There are a few points in this piece where I end up having to let it dry before continuing, because I don't exactly follow that rule very well. Also, with using the ballpoint pen, there's a bit of ink that collects on the tip as I work and forms a blob. To make sure that that blob doesn't drop on my surface, especially in an area that I need to keep light or especially consistent, I'll wipe it off on a paper towel or a cloth as I work, just so that it doesn't cause an unhappy accident in the piece. I've learned that one the hard way. And now it's to the stage of building up shading in various elements, and hatching. The music really is a good fit on this one though. V first appeared in 1982 in the Warrior Anthology book in Britain before being published in the US under DC Comics in 1987. The comic and character was created and written by Alan Moore and illustrated by David Lloyd and Tony Ware, and based in concept on Guy Fawkes, a failed revolutionary in Britain in 1605, who was hung and drawn and quartered at the age of 35 for his part in the Gunpowder Plot. While I haven't read the comic, I've watched the 2006 movie by James McTeague many times, a personal favorite, really, where V is played by Hugo Weaving. Since the movie came out, the mask of V has been co-opted by the hacktivist group Anonymous and memes across the internet symbolizing anarchy, rebellion, and vengeance against political villainy. A suitable role model for the challenges present in the modern day. While my chosen pose in this one is fairly basic, I am trying to capture the character's posturing nature, as he would typically lecture before enacting his vengeance on whatever subject he felt deserved it. To fill the composition and suggest a setting, I chose to put him in a generic, shadowy catacomb kind of area, nothing too crazy in the background, as I'm going to rely on contrast and a lot of penning to develop the dynamic interest in this one. This piece took just about 5 hours in real time to draw out and shade, and I barely got it under 35 minutes for the video. I'd thought of cutting out some of the chunks of the shading process, but opted to crank up the time elapse in a few areas, as you may notice by the time elapse indicator I've included in this video. I don't know if that will be a regular thing though, but to show the real development of the piece, I did want to include it here. Especially in the sense that this kind of shading is the real labor of the piece, it's incredibly time consuming, and the decisions involved are usually more along the lines of, why am I doing this in pen? And the next piece I do is not going to have this much shading. Hell, the next 5. And more commonly, this isn't dark enough, and don't put your hand in the wet ink. As usual, I do something slightly awkward with the left hand. I feel that the fingers are too stiff, and I probably could have put another knife in his hand here. I didn't. And for the rules of the sketchbook, I go with it. And as the piece progresses, I think the shading really holds this left hand together, and it doesn't stand out as much as an awkward element. I mentioned before that I really liked the V for Vendetta movie, and was inspired by its dystopian vision of a fascist nation amongst a world in decline so much that I got a V mask early on, and went as V for Halloween one year. It was an inexpensive and simple enough costume, and an easy choice for those early bar hopping days, and I've appreciated that it's left a mark on real-world culture, and wildly predictive, especially considering the story first came out in the early 1980s. Which may be the only criticism I have for it, is that the world depicted in V is getting too close to home, and it's not a world I had hoped to live in, yet seems to be the kind of darker New World Order that some people seem to want to force into occurring. But at least V has an inspiring philosophy and a few suggestions on how to reset the course of a wayward nation. And as I shaded in this piece bit by bit, I had plenty of time to think about the audacity of V and his vendetta. I really crank up the time elapse at times here, as the shading isn't that interesting to follow, even at 12 times speed. As far as choosing bad places to start, picking the far right section of the cape here is a real contender. I had to let this dry a bit before I was able to work on the other sections. You may notice in the video that I had a hard time finding a place to rest my hand as I continued to finish what should have been the last section instead of the first. And instead of moving to the far left section, I decided to do the bottom of the tunic, and still having to float my hand off the paper because I didn't wait long enough for the first portion to dry. I zoom way in for a bit here, hoping that the new camera could handle it. Or perhaps it's a skill issue, and I just need to figure out my camera better. And finally moving to the far left section. Thankfully, I figure it out somewhat, that I've gone through these sections backwards. And a bit of a jump cut there for anyone still watching. Through recording this piece, I filled the standard 32 gig memory card that the new camera came with twice. And in that process, actually lost a bit of footage because the camera ran out of storage. So there's a couple of rough jump cuts. Not to mention the changing white balance due to my studio's lighting conditions, namely a skylight that can create intense and difficult to manage shadows and white balance issues. But none of those problems have been deal breakers for the new camera. Just little things to solve as I go. Notice in each of the sections of the inner cape, I added additional crease detail as I shaded them in, giving the shading a bit of something to break it up and give a little extra detail in these areas, as I knew I wasn't going to fully black them out. Once the cape is pretty much shaded in, I can work the legs in a way that preserves the forms, but gets them dark enough so that they don't look like Robin's tights. Another challenge with recording these drawings as I am is that I can't monitor the equipment while I'm drawing, and I also can't do any retakes. Obviously, I can't redraw a portion of the piece. So each time I set up to draw and record, I have to mess with things as best I can, and then do a sitting, usually 30 minutes at a time. Those sittings will happen at various times of the day, as I can, over a couple of days. Once it's all done, I then bring the video clips into Resolve and have to contend with the footage I have, which isn't a complaint as much as a description of the process I'm following at this point in making videos, which has already changed a good bit from how I started, and I expect will continue to evolve as I make them. With the legs shaded, I can move to the boots. These are an element that I generalized, running off the edge of the page as they do, and knowing that there isn't going to be any real focus on them. They just have to be there, so I kept them simple. Of course, keeping my light source in mind from the figures left, a common choice for me with the drawing videos. You'll see as we get into the last third of this piece that I have these white areas for the edges of the elements throughout the figure. And while I need these areas to show those edges, I don't need them so stark as negative space elements. So I'll shade those in carefully, completing the shadow and form aspects of the elements and how they over and underlap. With a piece that has this much shading, I expected to burn out a pen, and probably would have if I didn't misplace the pen I'd been using at first, and had to pull out a fresh one. That's a thing I'm always impressed with though, running out a ballpoint pen from brand new. And it's not so much V's character arc that I find the most interesting about the story, but the world that he lives in, and its overt 1984 vibe. With just a few descriptive lines of exposition, the movie at least is able to paint a larger world in decline and turmoil, and how the government uses that as justification of wrong actions because we had no choice, and for the greater good, which can be very dangerous tells for a system gone bad, and further graying out the differences between light and dark. Heavily shaded dark pieces like this one in particular kind of fascinate me in their process, as so much is put into the constructing of a framework that is then draped with black, and it's the light spots that end up giving the elements their form and place in the piece, without becoming a confusing mess. The various points of detail in the piece add a lot of curious interest. The daggers in the belt with a bit of glint, the one in his hand, and the stark contrast to the mask against the heavy shading around it. And I spent a good amount of time trying to get areas of the figure as dark as I could. I want to get the figure done before moving to the background, especially at this point, where I wasn't sure if I wanted to add a lot of detail to the background or leave it generalized. If this wasn't a piece for the sketchbook, I probably would have called it done without a shaded background, but I have to put in as much to the page as I can for the sake of the book. And so getting into this background, I do add a bit of dimension into these oval cutouts I started with. thinking this would give me a good contrast point and break up the dark areas I planned. And then I just started scribbling it in, filling in as much area as loosely as I have to, just to start building up ink in the areas I'm shading. I do, after all, want that hatchy 380 billion lines of shading kind of texture to the piece overall. I'm weird like that. So I'm cross-hatching like a lunatic. These layers do have a method to their seeming madness, though. I keep them fairly structured at first, with larger patches being filled in with each pass, and then get more chaotic in smaller patches as I continue to add layers to the hatching overall. At least with this hatch shading, I start off the far left and work my way across, keeping my hand out of the fresh ink. People do learn. And building up the darkest areas in the cutouts to suggest some kind of passages. But as far as going super heavy with the background overall, I'm just not doing that here. This piece has already doubled the normal time I plan to spend on these. And don't mind the scratches on my hand, they're from my cat Sonic. We get a little rowdy from time to time. And then finally doing the heavy shading in the other cutout at the far edge of the page, as should be the proper procedure. This left hand is a great example of contrast and building up shading as you go. The area around the hand is lightly shaded in, but I wanted to give it a bit more contrast against the dark areas of the cutout, so in leaving a halo around the hand here, I can still create that strong contrast and not lose the definition of the hand. Also notice how I build up the edges in that initial halo, and how I gave myself a lot of space to do those refinements, instead of squeezing in on the hand right away. As we get to the end of things here, I am thoroughly exhausted by the ballpoint hat shading of this piece. I'm just glad to be getting done with it. I left an empty space at the bottom left of the page. Not too worried about what it's supposed to be in the scene, I needed to leave somewhere to sign this thing, but I do give it a bit of cross-hatching to blend it in with everything else a little. And finally, the mask. These bits of shading really tie everything together. Though I have to be careful with adding anything here. I don't want to lose the effect of the white mask against the dark shading around it. But I do want to get those values in and capture this highly iconic design. It's turned out fine and has a striking effect, but I can't help to think that I could have done more with the figure. Maybe zoomed in a bit more on his upper body and face. That would have left me more room for the detail in his mask, and reduced how much heavy shading I ended up doing, but I could spend days on what I could have done differently. Instead, I'll accept what I've ended up with and appreciate it for what it is. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. It would mean a lot if you gave the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in seeing more stuff like this. We've got t-shirts, art prints, art books, free comics online, and a Patreon page for all the behind the scenes action and early access to a bunch of content and projects. All the links for that stuff are in the description. And finish up the edge shading around that left hand before giving it the signature in a pen toss. Thanks for stopping by, and check us out in the next video where I draw another warrior against fascism, Indiana Jones.